Hello, my name is Elif Bulut. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Center for Demography and Population Health at Florida State University. And today I'll present findings from my research on female labor force participation rates among women in the United States from Middle East and North African origin. And in this study, I, with Dr. Carson, focus on differences by nativity status, and we investigate the role of ethnically homogamous relationships in explaining these variations. So allow me to briefly talk about how I got interested in this topic. Years ago, I read a paper by a sociologist at Duke, Janine Gazal-Reed. She talked about an education employment paradox among Arab women in the United States, such that these women had higher educational achievements but lower employment rates than most women in the United States. So hers was a qualitative study, and I wanted to see whether the same pattern holds quantitatively using census data. And it did. I found that Arab women in the United States had significantly lower labor force participation compared to other women in the United States. And after doing some more research, I learned that this paradoxical pattern was a global phenomenon, not only for Arab women, but women from the Middle East in general. And some called it the MENA paradox, referring to the low female labor force participation rates in the MENA region, despite rising female educational attainment and closing of the gender gap in education. So why study labor force participation of women from MENA origin? First, because immigrants from MENA in the United States are a growing and increasingly important segment of American society. And secondly, because women's labor force participation is a sign of immigrants' economic and social integration into the mainstream society. It's also a marker of immigrant achievement, as it suggests access to economic power, which is linked to gender equality at the societal level. So based on theory and research on female labor force participation and research on immigrant integration, we tested 3 hypotheses. Some research reveals that differences by nativity status may in part account for the low levels of labor force activity among this population. For example, research has shown that among Arab women in the United States, foreign-born women report significantly lower levels of employment than their US-born counterparts. And by extension, we expect that foreign-born women from the MENA will report lower employment compared to their US-born counterparts. And this foreign-born disadvantage may be especially important for our investigation because 70% of all MENA women in our sample are foreign-born. We also hypothesize that some of the disadvantage experienced by the foreign-born women might be due to a lack of acculturation to the American society, with the assumption that women with the longer residence in the United States with US citizenship and with higher levels of English fluency will have higher employment rates than more recent immigrants, as they are more likely to possess the skills to navigate the labor market. So although these factors are important for employment, the empirical evidence regarding their significance for some groups of minority women are inconclusive. For example, prior research has shown that Arab women reported lower employment than most women in the United States, despite having English language proficiency levels, which is only second to Filipina immigrant women. So we expect that these acculturation factors will only partially account the variation in employment among these women. And finally, we predict that homogamy will predict lower employment for these women, and group differences in the levels of homogamy will explain the observed differences across groups. So recent research has suggested that looking more closely at the influence of homogamy on immigrant women's economic activity may be rewarding. This research has suggested that women may coordinate their labor market decision, their labor market behavior with their partners, and this may explain the differences in women's employment patterns. And based on these findings and using census data, we expect that homogamy will explain the group differences in labor force participation across nativity groups. And data for our study come from public use microdata samples from 2012 to 2016 American Community Surveys, which is conducted by Census. And this data is well suited for our investigation for a number of reasons, but most importantly, it has a comprehensive question on ancestry, from which our measure of national origin is derived. And our target population is women in the United States from MENA origin who claim one of the 15 national origin and ethnicities, and these include women in the United States who are Algerian, Arab, and so on, who are including first, second, and higher generations. Because data did not include observations from 7 MENA countries, our final working sample included 15 MENA countries of origin, and accounting for a total of 33,313 MENA women who are in the prime working age of 25 to 59. And 70% of our working sample are foreign-born. So our primary outcome of interest is labor force participation, which is coded as a dummy variable, indicating whether the respondent has employment or actively seeking for employment, or not working and not seeking to work. And we use a number of measures that account for immigrants' acculturation to the American society, including nativity status, U.S. citizenship status, and English fluency. We also control for a number of socio-demographic measures, including age, marital status, education, presence of preschool children at home, and logged residual family income. We wanted to isolate the effect of women's own personal income on family income, so we calculated the residual income by subtracting family income from women's own personal income. And lastly, we control for homogamy. So we measure homogamy by using a composite homogamy model. To this end, what we did was to merge individual level data with household level data and created a matrix that draws on nativity and ethnicity of both women and their partners, if there is any. So this matrix consists of 10 categories of couple combinations specified as follows. And this combined homogamy categories allows us to examine the cumulative effect of both nativity and ethnicity of women and their partners on labor market activity. So overall, we are interested in examining the effect of homogamy on labor force participation of MENA women, and we are also interested in assessing whether the homogamy effect persists net of all covariates. And here is what we have found. Findings from our bivariate analysis show that MENA women in the United States report significantly lower rates of labor force participation compared to their non-MENA counterparts. Specifically, 62% of MENA women are in the labor force compared to 74% of non-MENA women. And this difference is significant. This figure provides more detailed evidence by showing that across major race ethnic groups in the United States, MENA women have the lowest levels of labor force participation. So what can account for these large differences? Existing explanations point to differences in human capital. Looking at first human capital characteristics, lower levels of labor force participation among these women are puzzling and surprising because these women have higher educational levels and higher levels of family income compared to most women in the United States. So overall, human capital characteristics do not appear to account for the large differences in employment. So we hypothesize that differences by nativity status will account for the differences. Immigrant status will predict lower labor force participation for these women. And consistent with our hypotheses, our analysis reveals that foreign-born MENA women are significantly less likely to be in labor force compared to their US-born counterparts. And here, notably, labor force participation among US-born MENA women are comparable to that reported by non-MENA women, which is 76% for US-born MENA women, and it was 74% for American women in general. So this is important because our findings show that foreign-born MENA women in our sample and in general in the United States, they make up 70% of all MENA women in our sample. And this suggests that low levels of labor force participation of these women depend in part on the fact that most of these women are foreign-born. So here the question is, in what ways foreign-born status shapes labor force outcomes of these women? So on the one hand, these immigrant women appear to have high levels of acculturation to the society. They have high levels of citizenship, high levels of English fluency, and high levels of residence in the United States. Although these measures are positively and strongly correlated with employment, we found that they only very partially account for the differences in labor force activity across nativity status. And finally, we hypothesize that the homogamy will predict lower labor force activity for this population. And before we introduce any controls, I'll present bivariate results in this figure. This figure displays labor force participation rates across 10 categories of couple combinations and shows a clear negative correlation between homogamy and labor force participation. It shows that regardless of nativity status, whether you are foreign-born or US-born, MENA women report considerably lower labor force participation when their partners are MENA men, especially foreign-born MENA men. This is important because nearly 2/3 of foreign-born MENA women have foreign-born MENA partners. 66% of these women have foreign-born MENA partners. It also shows that regardless of nativity status, when these women have non-MENA partners, especially US-born non-MENA partners, they experience higher levels of labor force participation. And results from our multivariable models show that the negative impact of homogamy still holds even after controlling for all the other factors. Similar to our bivariate results, the results from our OLS models show that regardless of nativity status, women who are coupled with MENA men still experience significantly lower odds of being in labor force. And for example, foreign-born women who are coupled with foreign-born MENA men are 51% less likely to be in labor force. And again, same with the US-born MENA women. When they have US-born MENA partners, they have 42% lower odds being in labor force. On the other hand, in general, both US-born and foreign-born women, when their couples are non-MENA, they have higher odds of being in labor force. So all of this suggests that the negative effect of homogamy is clearly a matter of ethnicity rather than nativity. So overall, our study highlights two important findings. First is foreign-born status is critical for labor force participation because foreign-born women are significantly less likely to be in the labor force compared to US-born MENA women. And also our study shows that ethnic homogamy is harmful for labor force participation of these women. And the disadvantage experienced by immigrant MENA women is due mostly to high rates of ethnically homogamous relationships. And overall, in conclusion, our study identifies two important themes that inform research on immigrant integration and female labor force participation. First, our results speak to the economic integration achieved by second and higher generation MENA women. Our findings reveal that US-born MENA women reported higher levels of labor force participation compared to their foreign-born counterparts, but also their employment rates were comparable to other US-born women in the United States. This suggests that this provides evidence that, as for other immigrant groups in the United States, women from MENA are on a path to economic integration to this country. And secondly, our findings suggest that women's economic integration is positively and strongly linked to their degree of sociocultural integration. The specific study highlights ethnic homogamy as a structural cultural barrier for MENA women's labor force activity and suggests that empirical research should look beyond the commonly used indicators of human capital, such as education, income, and acculturation, and should consider partner characteristics as a key determinant of women's economic integration to this country.